Hey, welcome to our next screencast on evolution. This one is going to focus on population genetics. Population genetics is going to be studying evolution using genetic principles because evolution is a change in a population's genetic material over time. For example, we have a random little selection of beetles, and in the first generation, there are 75% that are green with the green gene, 25% are yellow. And then in the next generation, we have a slightly different percentage. So you know what has happened? A little bit of evolution. First, let's review the causes of variation from parent to child. It might be better to say from parent to offspring, because this applies to all sexually reproducing organisms. And even if we're talking about asexual organisms, there's still going to be variation. So we have mutations, genetic recombination during meiosis. Remember that recombination includes crossing over and independent assortment. Also, the random pairing of gametes. All of these things together make genetically unique organisms and also change the relative amount of different genes from generation to generation. Okay, for the rest of the screencast, we're going to look at the 5 ways that a population's genetic material can change. In other words, this is the 5 ways that evolution occurs. Notice this is not just due to natural selection. So if these 5 things don't happen, then there is genetic equilibrium, which means there's no variation or change in the genetic material over a population, which also means there is no evolution. Mutations. We've learned about mutations already, so you may be able to fill in the blanks before I get there. So, mutations would be a change in DNA. They can be helpful, harmful, or no effect. Please remember that most mutations have no effect. Mutations in gametes are passed on to offspring. If you look at the tigers right here, the difference in coloration is due to mutations. So again, we said mutations be helpful or harmful or no effect. Obviously, the mutation here has an effect in different coloration. Depending on the environment of the particular tiger, might matter whether or not it's beneficial or if it's harmful. Next, we have gene flow. When we talk about gene flow, it is the flowing of genes. Now, if you think about it, the way that genes move is by organisms moving. So when you move from one place to another, well, you move your genes with you, unless you go buy some new ones that fit better. Okay, so gene flow is moving genes from one population to another. When individuals move, they move their genes. This is caused by immigration and emigration. Immigration is when things are moving in, emigration is moving out. So as the beetles here move from one population to another, well, they're moving their genes with them. This will change the frequencies of different genes. For example, the genes on the left, you're not going to have more light colored beetles. And over here on the right, we're bringing some dark colored beetles over. Now, you'll notice in describing gene flow, and we'll continue this with genetic drift, we're not talking about what makes an organism more likely to survive and reproduce. We're just talking about other factors that can change a gene frequency. So, genetic drift is when allele frequencies change by a random event. Now, When we talk about having a significant effect, we're going to either say it's a large or a small population. If you can imagine having a new student move in to Thomasville and go to Scholars Academy, most likely you're going to notice that new student in your grade because we're a pretty small school. If we were at a really large school, you may not notice just one new student moving in or moving out. So genetic drift is going to have a more significant effect on small populations because you don't have as many to begin with. Examples of things that can cause genetic drift include a lot of things. So, a lot of human impact, for example, building a road and separating two populations, or natural disasters like a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, or a fire that wipes out part of a habitat and whatever organisms just unluckily happen to be there. Next, we have non-random mating. As you listen and write this down, think about whether or not this applies to humans. So, non-random mating means that individuals select mates based on certain characteristics. Individuals are definitely going to choose mates that are nearby because that makes sense. This is actually an example of sexual selection, where females choose males based on certain traits. And remember that successful reproducers pass on traits, not successful survivors. Now, have you come up with some examples yet? What about a peacock? The reason why its tail is very large, bright, colorful, and symmetrical has nothing to do with surviving, has everything to do with reproducing. A peahen will only be attracted to a peacock that has a tail like this. So in order to reproduce, guess what? You got to have a tail. Another example is the Irish elk that you watched a video about a while ago. Here's a fossilized skull of one, and you can see how big the horns were, or excuse me, the antlers were. Last, we have natural selection. As we've learned before, organisms with the best genes are more likely to survive and reproduce. And remember that if the environment changes, different genes may be selected for. So, one gene is not always beneficial. It depends on the environment. Also, keep in mind that we're not just talking about only one gene. There's lots of genes. So if you're a polar bear and you might have clear fur so you can blend in with the environment, but if you don't also have blubber, well, you're still not going to survive no matter how much you blend in. Okay, there are three types of natural selection: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Let's look at each of these. Directional selection is natural selection that favors a specific trait. This would be a trait at one of the extremes. There are two examples we have here: insect resistance to a pesticide. So once a pesticide is applied, those that are resistant to the pesticide are the ones more likely to survive. Fur color or color of moths, as in this graph, would be another example. So for example, the graph that we have here, we have these lighter colored moths right here and the darker ones. The original population shown by blue, we have the lighter peppered moths. Those are the ones that are found the most, the ones that are most likely to survive and reproduce. However, there's a whole phenotypic range for what that color could be. The average is right here, but they could be darker, they could be lighter. It's just that most of them are most likely to survive right here. Now, if there's some sort of environmental change, like increased pollution, so now the trees are darker, well, the ones that were darker are now the ones that are more likely to survive. So we're moving, natural selection is going in a direction. Stabilizing selection is when natural selection favors individuals most like everybody else, like in the middle of some sort of phenotype. This would occur in a stable environment where it's beneficial to be more in the middle. One example is birth weight in humans. Another example is the number of eggs a bird may lay. Of course, it varies based on the species, but if you lay too many, well, then you're not going to be able to care for all of them, and those birds are less likely to survive. But if you don't lay enough, well, then you're not going to increase the population. So in this case, it looks like about 5 would be the optimal amount. Last, we have disruptive selection. This is when natural selection favors two distinct traits, and it results in the disappearance of the in-between trait. For example, we have some bunny rabbits, and the original population, most of them were white. And then there was a change in the environment, and now it's beneficial to be able to blend into your environment. So having a dark color or this little kind of spotted color, both of those are the ones that are more likely to survive. Okay, and that's all for this screencast